Billionaire saw his father crying in the black maid's arms. Then she exposed a hidden secret. He was not expected until morning, but the plane touched down early, and the car ran through a city that was strangely kind to his timing, green lights all the way to the gates. He told the driver to take the back route and let him out by the service entrance. He never used it, but he liked the idea of arriving unseen, of catching the house asleep and his thoughts unguarded. The kitchen was clean and quiet, stainless steel reflecting the dim overheads. The air smelled of lemon oil and something faintly sweet, as if the house had been recently lulled into order. He heard a sound he did not understand, not a clatter, not a laugh, a raw sound, caught and held. He moved toward it before he knew he was moving. Past the pantry, into the corridor with the family portraits, down toward the sunroom at the end, where the light fell in squares on the floor. The sound came again, and then words he could not make out. He stopped at the doorway. His father was folded into the long-time black housekeeper's arms, his shoulders shaking. His head rested against her collarbone the way a child leans when grief is heavier than bone. She had one hand at the back of his neck, and one at his spine, fingers spread wide and steady, and she rocked him almost imperceptibly, a cradle made of patience. There was nothing hurried about the way she held him. She was neither startled nor ashamed. She was busy with the sacred work of comfort. The billionaire felt heat rise against cold. His throat closed in a way boardrooms never could manage, everything inside him demanding to separate the sight into manageable parts. He had seen his father furious, calculating, triumphant. He had seen him sick and dismissive of sickness. He had never seen him break. He had never seen anyone hold him like that. He took a step, and the old floor answered, a small complaint that still pierced the scene. Her eyes lifted and found his. The calm in them checked him harder than any rebuke. She did not let go of his father. She did not flinch. She saw all of him, travel creases in his jacket, the thin impatience he wore like a cufflink. The boy who had grown tall in this house, and somehow still did not know where the corners were. "What is this?" he said. He meant to say it softly, but something sharp got into it. "What happened? What did you do to him?" A flicker, not of offense but of decision, crossed her face. She lowered her gaze to the man in her arms and smoothed his hair, the way she had smoothed spilled milk from a boy's cowlick long ago. "Hush now," she murmured into his father's temple. "Breathe with me. In and out. Good, that is it." Then, to the billionaire, pitched barely above a whisper that still filled the room, she said, "Not like this, not from the doorway. This is my house," he said, and hated the sound of it even as he said it. It came out brittle and expensive. "It is his home too," she said, and he could feel the weight she gave the word. She nodded toward the hall. "Give us a moment." He did not move. He could not stop looking at his father's hands, the way they clutched at the sleeve of her cardigan, the tremor that ran through the knuckles he had once believed indestructible. He dropped his voice. "Tell me what is going on." Her eyes did not leave his. He saw in them the same unfrightened steadiness he had leaned on all his life without admitting he was leaning. She said, "We will talk. You will hear what you came to hear, and what you did not know you needed, but not while he is like this. His dignity is not a price I will let you pay for speed." He was not accustomed to gates he could not buy open. The urge to press, to pin the conversation against the wall and shake loose its secrets, rose like a tide. He could feel the arguments queuing up in his mouth. He wanted to know the who and the why and the damage. He wanted to catalogue it, to assign it to a team, to fix it by the afternoon. And then his father made a sound and reached, blindly, for the hand that had always been there. The billionaire stood very still. He remembered a fever and a cool cloth. He remembered shoes shined on the morning of a school ceremony he had pretended not to care about. He remembered the housekeeper's laugh in the kitchen, the way it warmed the glass and the tiles, and the way she had looked at him when he got something right and when he got something wrong. He knew suddenly that if he forced her now, if he broke this moment open with the pry bar of his will, whatever came out would be damaged by the manner of its birth. He stepped back. The doorframe was cool, against his palm. He said, in a voice that surprised him by not breaking, "Fine." "A moment." "Thank you," she said, and returned her full attention to the man in her arms. He moved into the corridor and found the study without seeing it. The house went on with its quiet breathing. He stood by the window, where the ivy crawled, and stared at the lawn without seeing the green. He put his phone on the desk and did not touch it. He checked the time by instinct, and found that time had nothing to offer. He listened to footsteps, to a car in the distance, to the click of a heating vent. He thought about the meetings he had left unread, the signatures waiting for his hand, the constellation of obligations that usually charted his sky. They felt false, like lights strung up to distract children from the dark. When she came, it was without ceremony. She closed the study door behind her, and for a second he was a boy, court-summoned, waiting to be told what he already suspected. She did not sit. She stood, with her hands folded, not out of deference, but because she had learned how to hold herself when the ground moved. There was no trace of the tears she had collected, only the scent of starch and lemon that he associated with clean beginnings. He looked past her at the hallway, wanting to see if his father was still shaking. He stopped himself. He said, "You said we would talk." "We will," she said. "When the house quiets, when he has rested, when you have taken the anger out of your mouth so your questions can be heard. Some truths are doors. You cannot run through them without breaking the hinges." "I have the right to know," he said. "You have the right to know," she agreed. "And he has the right to be the one who tells you what he can, in the way he can bear. I am asking you for patience I know you were not taught to value. I am asking you to give me a little trust, the kind you only use when you cannot buy certainty." His chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with travel. He nodded, small, and then again, when she did not lower her eyes. He said, "Is he going to be all right? He has carried something heavy for a long time," she said. "Weight changes a person, but it can be set down." She looked at his face, as if reading the places where pride had been bruised in the last 10 minutes. "I did not want you to find out like this. But there is no clean way to unwrap certain things. They cut even when you are careful." He swallowed. "Is this about the company?" "Not only," she said. He took a step closer, and she held up a hand. "Enough for now. Eat something. Breathe air that is not recycled. I will come to you when the sun lowers and the house goes soft. He will sleep. You will listen. We will be usefully brave." She turned to leave, and he said her name without saying it, a soft syllable of gratitude and impatience and fear. She paused. "I know," she said. "You want it to make sense. It will. Not all at once. But it will." Then she was gone, her steps steady on the wood, the door left ajar by intention. The billionaire stood still in the room that had been his childhood sanctuary and his adult office, and for the first time in a very long time, he allowed something other than control to sit beside him. In the hallway, the housekeeper's voice drifted back, low and sure, and he pictured again the way she had held his father like a secret she had been trusted with long before any of them knew its name. He did not know if the world outside had stopped, but he knew this house had shifted. The truth was here, pressing up against the walls, patient as a tide. He would wait for it to come in. She arrived with a small case and a steady gaze that seemed to inventory both the dust on the baseboards and the ache hiding in people. By the time the kettle sang, the house had already tilted toward her. Rugs lay straighter, the flowers on the hall table no longer looked stiff, and the glass, once smudged by restless fingers, showed the day as if it were new. She did not bark or bustle. She moved like someone placing stitches, quiet and sure, leaving the threads to bind only when no one was watching. The boy noticed first in small ways. The staircase no longer creaked under his nightly journeys to the kitchen. His pencils returned to his desk, sharpened and aligned. A matched pair of socks appeared on his feet in the morning, warm from sitting near a vent. When he scraped his knees on the gravel drive, a hand that smelled of lemon and starch wiped the grit away, while a soft voice told him to look at the sky. The kitchen filled with the sonorous rhythm of her humming. He learned by that sound where she was, and how near safety might be. Others learned her steadiness in their own measure. Drivers came early because she greeted them by name and set a cup of coffee in their hands. Gardeners lingered to pull weeds from the beds because she complimented the symmetry of their lines and left them a basket of preserved fruit in the pantry. The cook found her voice growing smooth and deep, when previously it had snapped, because she felt listened to and seen. Even the family dog, temperamental and fierce, lay down at her feet and slept. The father learned to trust her presence the way sailors learn lighthouses. He never said so. He never said much. His days were arranged by other men in other rooms, and he entered his own house as if the door, however grand, led to a stage where he had to hold himself a particular way. Still, the back of his shoulders eased when she stood at the doorway, hands folded, taking in the weather of his face. She would not meet him in the front hall when his guests were present, but he knew the kettle would be ready by the time he shed his jacket, and a quiet room would wait for him behind the library, with a chair that rocked and a window that opened onto the oaks. The boy received his lessons there, between the scuffs on the wooden floor and the house lights that came on at dusk. She taught him to fold a napkin into a clean triangle and tie his laces in a way that did not loosen. She taught him to speak to people who wore uniforms, to look at them directly, to hear their answer and thank them for their work. When he fumbled with the concept of apology, she showed him how to practice the words until they felt natural in his mouth. When he sat on the back steps and asked why some people turned their faces from her, she set down a basket and did not move for a long moment. Then she said, "No one can set the measure of your respect but you." He never forgot the precise weight of her words. He began to notice the other weight that hung in the air when his father was near her. Not a romance, no. Something older, thicker, made of promises too heavy to lift. It lived in the pantry when the door closed and their murmurs traveled through wood. It lived in the ledger she kept in a locked drawer, a ledger his father had once touched with his fingertips, and then withdrew from, as if it burned. It lived in the way she accepted envelopes and returned them later, thinner, and in the moment when she looked his father full in the face and he looked away. After charity dinners, she would stand in the corridor outside the ballroom, half in shadow, to watch for the boy's return. He would slip his hand into hers and tell her what the men with polished shoes had said to him, the phrases that felt like hard candy in his mouth. She would listen, and tap her thumb against his knuckles, a rhythm that meant, "You are heard." When a guest once called her by a title that was not her name, sharp and dismissive, she bowed her head and moved to the side. The boy looked to his father, but his father did not speak. Later, the father crossed the length of the house with his tie undone, and his eyes red at the edges, and sat in the rocking chair, and she poured tea and set it before him, and he said, "I could not." Her answer was quiet. "Your choice drew a line. We both live on it." The house adjusted itself around that line. New carpets covered the scuffed floors. The nursery became a study. The staff changed, but certain objects endured. A small locket, kept in a box near the ironed linens. A photograph turned face down in the bottom drawer of the desk in the room behind the library. A key that hung on a nail inside the broom closet, polished by the touch of two people only. The boy touched none of these, though he knew they existed. He learned to look and then not to look, and to accept that some maps cannot be drawn until the ground has shifted beneath your feet. Once, long after midnight, the boy woke to the quiet snick of a back door. He crept to the landing in his socks. Outside, under the oaks, the father stood with his shoulders bowed. The woman stood before him, her robe belted tight, her hair wrapped. He handed her a bundle wrapped in cloth. She took it, pressed it close, and nodded. A car idled beyond the hedge. She walked toward the gate, her figure a shadow against the darker dark, and the boy saw the father press his palms together and hold them to his mouth. She returned before dawn. No one spoke of it, and there was the morning of the funeral. The house smelled of lilies and wax. People moved through the rooms like a tide, up the steps and down again, bearing trays and speeches, and the formal grief of strangers. In the hush that followed the last condolence, the father remained in the library, stiff and hollow, staring through the glass. The boy stood on the landing, hidden by the curve of the wall. She crossed the carpet, set her hand on the father's shoulder, and the man who had taught the boy that the world requires a certain posture began to shake. He put his face into her shoulder. His breath hitched like a child's. She held him without a tremor. When he calmed, she took his face in her hands and spoke with no force, and no sound the boy could fully hear. He caught only two words: keep faith. The boy's life grew up around the lattice of that phrase. He carried it with him as he outgrew his shoes and then his rooms, and as he found himself among people who thought money answered every question. He learned that she did not place herself at the head of any table, yet people arranged themselves by the grace of her judgments. He watched her hire and release, teach and forgive, and knew that the shape of this house was her work as much as anyone's. He also carried the quiet knowledge that something had been exchanged long before he had the language to name it, and that it threaded through his father's silence and her steady gaze. He would hear the secret in full later, opened like a door he had passed for years without a key. But even then, even before the day he saw his father return to that shoulder and weep again, He understood that the home that held them was bound by a pact made in a world that bent people into corners. She had stayed. He had let her. Between them, they had made a shelter and called it a household, and the boy, not yet a man, learned to stand on that line and keep his balance. He found them in the library where the old portraits watched everything and the curtains held the afternoon light like a secret. The chair by the window had always been his father's throne, a place for decisions, for contracts, for the pose of certainty. It was not a place he expected to see, a bowed head and shaking shoulders. The housekeeper's arms were around him, her cheek against his hair, the soft murmur in her chest, the kind of sound that steadied a child after a nightmare. He had never seen his father cry. Not once in his empire's long, proud march. The housekeeper looked up when he stepped inside, the sort of glance that weighed a soul. She did not drop her hand from his father's shoulder. "Close the door," she said. He did, and the click sounded like a key turning in a lock that had waited for years. "Your father asked me to keep something safe," she said. He could not look at her when she said it. He stared at the carpet as if there were maps in the weave that could lead them away from whatever was about to happen. She went to the shelves and slid aside a row of books, with the ease of someone who knew every inch of the room. Behind them, a panel was fitted into a shallow recess, lacquered to match the wood. Her fingers found the lip, and the panel came free with a hush. Inside lay a small steel box, dull with age and touched at the edges by dust. She set it on the desk. The box looked like it belonged in a different house, one where people did not pretend a certain kind of cleanliness could cover what had been swept beneath the rug. For years, she said, a thin chain had glittered at her throat. He had seen it over breakfast plates, in the garden, in the glow of holiday lights. It had seemed like a small ornament. Now she drew the chain out from beneath her collar, and on it hung a key no larger than a thumb. Her hands were steady. The lock turned without protest, as if relieved. The scent that rose when the lid opened was old ink and cedar, and something like rain in dust. Inside were letters tied with faded ribbon, brittle deeds folded in quarters, and a long plastic case that held recordings. There were photographs too, speckled with time, where young faces looked straight at the camera, daring it to remember them. He reached for a letter, and saw the seal of a bank that had helped build the world he knew. The handwriting was clean and confident. It spoke of opportunity, of a land purchase that would secure the family's footing, of a chance to lift a fledgling venture into a juggernaut. Then the phrases grew sharper. About delays and stubborn owners, about municipal friends, about tax assessments, about calling in favors, so that the sale could be done before the summer harvest. The tone was polite, even warm, and that made it worse. He imagined the polite smile that can hide a sneer. The housekeeper picked up a deed, unfolded it along its ancient creases. There was the family name he bore, printed in bold ink. There was a signature, he recognized from the portrait on the stairs, and another mark only an X, written beside a name he did not know, with a note in a clerk's hand that the seller could not sign for himself. Her finger hovered over the X, then retreated, as if touching it would wound her. Her breath was careful. "My people kept a garden there," she said quietly, "and children played under the pecan tree. The letters say they were paid fair. But my aunt told a different story. Men at the door, in the evening. A sheriff who was a friend to certain banks. A cousin who did not come home after he spoke too boldly in the store. We were told it would not end well if we did not agree." He slid the plastic case open, and the recording stared back like a glass eye. The housekeeper set the player on the desk and clicked it on. A voice filled the room, crisp and familiar in its cadence, though he had never heard it tremble. It spoke of parcel lines and projections, of moving obstacles, of clearing a neighborhood that was in the way. It spoke of a congregation the board would have to placate, and a widow who would not. A second voice suggested a tax lien might loosen her, and a third voice laughed, a soft, polite laugh that made his skin crawl. His father shut his eyes. "I knew some of this," he said, and his voice had the frayed edge of linen pulled too long. "I heard pieces when I was young. I asked questions and was told to mind the business, to be proud of what our name built. When I took the seat at that desk, I told myself it was in the past. I told myself that donations and scholarships could be our apology. Then the letters came about the waterfront. The same patterns. The same words. They want me to make it happen. Before the season turns. They say, it is good for the city, for the market, that the law allows it, that the plan is brilliant. It would push out a neighborhood that bears her name and the stories of her family. The housekeeper's gaze did not break. I hoped it would not come to this, she said. I went to meetings. I sat in rooms where maps were spread on tables, and I asked questions into air that did not hear me. I gave your father this box 2 winters ago. He could not open it. He asked me to wait until you were ready to see what you were walking over. He looked again at the letters, at the photographs where the air seemed gold, and the ground looked rich. He remembered sitting at her kitchen table as a boy, when his mother was away, and the house was too large. When the housekeeper had cut his toast into squares and told him stories about a town by the river, where everyone knew each other's names, he had assumed it was a fairy tale built out of cinnamon and summer. He had never connected it to the parcel in their earliest portfolio, the one that had brightened their ledgers and opened doors in banks across the country. "This is why you were crying," he said to his father. "Not for me," said the man in the chair, and his jaw took on the shape of confession. "For what I could not undo, for what I kept quiet when I should have thundered. They asked me yesterday for my signature, and I could not lift the pen. I thought of her aunt, and that ex, and I thought of my father's smile when he told me we were on our way. I thought I would be sick if I did it again. So I called her, and I asked her to bring what she had kept." He had never envied the weight his father carried. Now, he understood its shape. He also understood that the weight did not belong to them alone. It had sat on this woman's shoulders every day she unpacked groceries in their kitchen, every time she walked past the portrait on the stairs. She had kept their house, yes, but she had also kept their truth in a steel box hidden behind a book about leadership. She straightened the letters into a square stack and tied the ribbon as neat as a prayer. "This is not about pity," she said. "It is about naming what was taken and choosing something different. You can end the project. You can give back land. You can fund homes that are not run by distant men. You can say out loud what was done, and let the light touch it. I am not here to ruin you. I am here to say the past cannot be buried in a place where people still live with its teeth in them." He traced a thumb over the face of a little girl in a photograph, one arm around the trunk of a tree that no longer existed. She had the kind of smile that dared the future to be kind. He felt a door open inside him, a draft of air he had been avoiding. He saw how the empire he had built contained a boarded room he had never entered. "Why did you keep this?" he asked her, "and not bring it to someone who could punish us?" "Because," she said, "you sat with me on the back steps when you were small and ate pie from the tin, and you listened to my stories without rolling your eyes. Because you said thank you and meant it. Because I have watched you send workers home to see their sick mothers and take the hit on the deadline rather than squeeze them dry. Because I wanted to believe that kindness would grow larger, not smaller, as you filled your suit." His father lifted his head, and his eyes were red but clear. "Call them," he said. "Tell them I am withdrawing my support. Tell them we will not move a single family. Tell them we will be making an announcement, and they will not like it." He looked from his father to the woman who had held them both up in different ways. The lockbox was open, the letters spread, as if the past itself had spilled onto the desk. Outside, the branches scraped the window pane. Inside, the air hummed with the old tape's quiet hiss. He picked up the phone, then set it down and reached for her hand instead. "Thank you," he said. "We will do this right, not just differently." The hand he held was warm and solid, a bridge between what had been and what might be. The father watched them, and the set of his mouth softened. Somewhere beyond the house, a siren rose and fell, the city itself breathing. They stood together, 3 people bound by a truth that had finally found its voice. The empire would look different come morning. That thought frightened him and steadied him. The lockbox did not close. It sat open on the desk, a small, plain altar to what had been done, and what would be chosen now. The heir sat at the long table with the lacquered shine and felt every eye on him. The chair cleared a throat and began to rehearse the script that had been drafted in dim rooms where conscience did not echo. The counsel pointed to phrases on a document and spoke of exposure, liability, and winnable margins. The publicist slid glossy mock-ups across the table, pale images of smiles and staged philanthropy, captions trimmed to soothe. Behind them, the wall of windows reflected the room back at itself, a panel of watchful specters. He kept seeing another room, smaller, warm from the afternoon sun, where the father had folded into the housekeeper's arms and wept like a man who had forgotten how to be held. He had never seen the father cry, not in anger, or in pride, not in triumph or ruin. It had undone him, that sight, and afterward the housekeeper had asked for tea and a quiet place to speak. She had spoken of a ledger and the letters kept in her trunk, of land taken under the cover of charity, and a death that had been called an accident while papers told a different story. She had spoken without heat, only with a steadiness that made the room feel anchored. She had placed the choice in his hands as if she were setting down a bowl of water and asking whether he intended to wash wounds or wash them away. The counsel pushed a statement across the table and tapped the page. Spare language, no admission, expressions of regret without a single detail that could take root. The chair slid a sheet toward him with decisions already boxed in, approvals ready, a calendar of appearances that would allow a semblance of contrition while the vault stayed sealed. The publicist spoke of narrative, of controlling the arc. He had learned to recognize the rehearsed smile, the careful tone that stretched sincerity thin enough to see through. He thought of the housekeeper in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled, her hair tied back. He thought of how she had fixed him with a look that refused to let him shrink himself into a position. She had told him a story about a sapling and a flood. She had said that people build walls to keep water out, but water finds every crack, every hidden channel. If you do not reroute it with care, it might spare you today and drown you tomorrow. Truth runs the same way, she had said, only it can water roots instead of tearing foundations. Repair begins when you learn the names of what you have broken, she had added, and let the harm set the terms for what wholeness requires. He could hear the cadence of her words even as the meeting ground on. The chair warned him of fiduciary duty. The counsel explained statutes and risks. The publicist dangled the approval that would come if he only played along. He kept his hands still and his face neutral and felt the floor tilt. In the glass, he saw his own jaw, his own practiced composure, and for a moment he found it hateful. He left the table without a word, a sea of murmurs breaking behind him, and took the elevator down to the kitchen. The housekeeper was there, drying a cup, the window open to let in air. She looked at him, and he told her the board would not permit an open reckoning. He listed the reasons they gave. He tried to make them sound like facts instead of fear. She set the cup down and folded the towel. There was weariness in her eyes, but there was not an ounce of surrender. She told him that every time he turned the truth into a posture, he weakened the ground under his own feet. She told him that his father had come to her because secrets had made his house unlivable. The father had asked what it would cost to leave a clean path for his children and for those who had been harmed. He wanted to pay quietly, she said, because he could not bear to be seen as small, but quiet had built the harm. Quiet had laid it like brick. He asked her what to do. He felt foolish asking, an heir with access to counsel and calculus, asking advice from the one person who refused to speak to him like a shareholder. She did not let him off with an easy blessing. She told him to tell the whole of it, not in euphemisms, and not as confession designed to win sympathy. She told him to open the records and invite those who had been pushed out of the room to sit at the head of the table. She told him to refuse the cruel convenience of private settlements and secret agreements that erased the past for a price. She told him to commit to repair that cost more than goodwill. He felt the weight of that word, cost, not as a market term but as a measure of what it means to be human. He nodded until nodding felt useless. He needed to choose. There are moments when an upbringing made of polished lessons becomes dead weight, and another hand reaches out from a different map and shows the way across. He took out his phone and told the publicist to cancel the glossy campaign. He told the counsel that the archive would be open to independent review. The chair called him reckless. There were threats of votes and clauses, invoked like curses. He stood very still and listened to the storm, then he hung up. He asked the housekeeper if she would stand with him when he spoke. She said she would not speak for him, but she would stand where anyone could see her and know that she did not run from her own truth. She told him she would stand with the families whose names had been turned into footnotes and bring them forward. She reminded him to name the harm himself. The voice that hides will always sound like the past. Words spread across a day that felt stretched beyond time. Reporters waited under the stone arch and near the fountain where donors had posed for photos. The board convened in a private line and used words meant to shame. The father did not come downstairs. The housekeeper, on her way to the door, paused at the base of the staircase and looked up, as if listening for a breath. Maybe she heard the father on the other side of that silence. Maybe she only heard herself. They walked out together. The air was bright, colder than it had been. The heir looked at the small sea of cameras, at the faces behind them. He felt the history that had built the stones under his feet, and the memory of whatever had been buried there. He thought of the housekeeper's story of water and roots. He thought of the father's tears, honest and ugly and human. He thought of the ledger she had kept, as if it were a lighthouse. He began to speak. He named what his company had done, what it had taken, what it had denied. He did not soften the verbs. He did not hide behind passive turns of phrase. He described what would change immediately, and what would require those harmed to determine the terms. He said that silence had fed the wealth he had inherited, and that he would not feed it any more. The housekeeper stood beside him, not as a symbol to be consumed by a camera, but as a living witness who had refused to let the past stay buried. She looked past the lenses into the faces of those who had come carrying questions and scars. The heir felt something loosen in his chest, not relief, not absolution, only the sturdy ache of facing forward. The storm was not over. It would break in a dozen ways. Yet in that moment, with the truth spoken aloud, and the doors to secrecy pried open, he understood the only choice that had ever mattered. He would not trade a clean future for a quiet lie. He would build his house on ground that could stand the rain. They set the chairs facing the old fountain, not toward the mansion. On the podium there was no crest, only a plank of reclaimed wood polished to a soft gleam. People gathered with folded arms and guarded eyes, their faces carrying stories the family portraits had never held. The air had a quiet cool that made every breath feel like preparation. The heir took his place and did not look at the cameras. He looked at the faces. His father stood a step behind, not towering as he once had, but almost tentative, hands clasped, eyes finding the housekeeper, and holding there like a mooring line. She was between them, and also beyond them. The one who had insisted that if there was to be speaking, there would also be listening. And not only that, there would be change that could be measured in more than words. When the heir began, his voice was rough. He told the truth in simple sentences. The house had been built on other people's labor. The fortune had been swollen by the cutting of corners, the silencing of pain, the settling of claims in back rooms with pens and pressure. He had learned all of this from records hidden in a cedar trunk, from whispered recollections in the kitchen, from a late night when he saw his father cry in the arms of the woman who had carried the keys, and the calendar, and so much else the family did not see. He said that this was not confession for absolution. It was a beginning to repair what could still be repaired. The father stepped up next. He did not read from the paper in his hand. He spoke about choices. He said he had been taught to prize winning, to protect the house at all costs, to believe that the ledger would forgive what the heart could not. He acknowledged the families whose names were missing from foundation plaques, whose hands had built canals and mills and roads, and never appeared in the photographs. He asked nothing. He offered what he had, the truth as he knew it, and the willingness to be led. The housekeeper did not take the podium so much as the moment. She did not speak in the careful language of publicists. She named harms. She named the people who had not been invited onto the lawn until now. She said repair was not charity and not a spectacle. It was debt. It would be paid in the currency of land returned where it could be returned, of wages owed and finally delivered, of contracts rewritten with dignity at their center, of a fund that the community would direct, not merely advise. She had pages in her hand that outlined the commitments, and she had already shown them to those who had the most right to revise every line. When the cloth fell away from the plaque at the fountain, there was no bronze boast. There was a list of acknowledgements etched into stone that admitted the industries and the injuries, the profits and the toll. People did not clap, some cried, some stood very still. A little girl traced a finger over a name and looked up at her grandmother, who nodded and squeezed her hand. After the speeches, there were tables under the trees. Not for celebration, but for signing. The heir placed his signature beneath a clause that removed his ability to unilaterally direct the fund. Seats on its board would be held half by people chosen from the neighborhoods and towns that had borne the burden, and half by those tasked to collect and distribute without fear. The housekeeper would serve as a senior advisor to the effort, with the authority to halt any plan that smelled of vanity rather than repair. She had insisted on that power. She had earned it long before this day. The first checks did not arrive in envelopes from a tower. Teams went out to kitchens and porches, to union halls and faith basements. They listened. They took notes. Where payment was due, it was delivered with letters that explained how the figure had been calculated, and with contact numbers that reached people who would pick up, where land could be restored, deeds were drafted and recorded. Where wealth had been extracted from rivers and fields, commitments were made to clean and to restore, not as a favor but as a settlement. The businesses that remained in family hands began to change their contracts with suppliers, to publish what they paid, to open the doors to inspectors who did not owe them anything. A workshop on the edge of town began training apprentices, with elder craft workers paid as teachers rather than squeezed as cheap labor. Inside the house, the legacy shifted in ways small and large. Portraits stayed on the walls, but each acquired captions that made room for the full story. An entire corridor was given over to photographs from the community, a mother braiding a child's hair before a late shift, a strike line in winter, a jubilant school band, marching past the mill gates that once shut them out. The ballroom was opened on weekends for community meetings, and the kitchen began to serve meals to people who would not have been welcomed at the front door a season ago. The housekeeper moved through it all, with a new badge clipped to her blouse that read advisor, though everyone knew her authority did not live in plastic or ink. It lived in the way people sat up when she entered a room, in the way the heir listened without interrupting, in the way the father lowered his eyes when she corrected him gently but firmly. She kept a notebook full of names and commitments and deadlines. She cultivated a steering group that included elders, young organizers, small business owners, and workers who still wore steel-toe boots and carried lunch pails. She led listening sessions where the heir learned to set down his pen and ask what repair would look like to someone who had watched a parent lose a home because the company would not stop deducting for tools they never owned. There were missteps. A news story accused the family of staging a performance. A grant application denied by the newly formed fund led to hard words and a revisiting of criteria that had been written by people with university degrees, but not also with lived experience of eviction. The heir stood in front of cameras again and said they had aired, and then he went back to the long tables under the trees and rewrote clauses with the steering group, taking out the language that had made people feel examined rather than trusted. On a quiet afternoon, the father sat on the back steps with a woman whose grandfather had died when a scaffold fell and whose case had been settled for a sum that barely paid for the coffin. He said he had known, and he had chosen not to know. She listened. She did not absolve him. She told him about the way her grandfather laughed, about the songs he sang when he was tired. When she left, she took with her a copy of the letter that would accompany the restitution payment and a promise that the accident site would be marked with a memorial. Later that week, a simple stone rose on the riverbank, and workers came at dawn to leave flowers shaped like gears and stars. The heir began to sell the objects he had once described to friends as trophies. A jet that had seen oceans was traded for scholarships. Paintings left the library walls and turned into seed capital for cooperatives. He stopped thinking of his name as a brand and began to think of it as a door he could hold open. He learned the bus routes. He stopped correcting people who called him by his first name only and started asking them for theirs so he could write letters that began with something other than dear, sir, or madam. At the kitchen table where the first secrets had cracked open, the housekeeper drew a circle on a piece of paper. In it she wrote the word legacy. Around it she placed small words like repair, memory, dignity, power shared, not gifted. The heir watched her, and then took the pen, and added a word that made his face tremble a little. He wrote future. The father, who had never been good with circles he had not drawn, placed his hand flat on the table, and said he would spend the days he had left making sure the circle closed where it had once been broken. Evenings were different now. Voices drifted in from the lawn where the steering group met beneath string lights. Children ran across the grass and pretended the fountain was a castle and the plaque a treasure map. Inside, the housekeeper kept the ledger of promises and crossed off nothing until it was truly done. The heir understood that repair had no finish line, only milestones. He did not feel redeemed. He felt responsible. He did not feel small. He felt placed in a story that was larger than the family name. And for the first time that did not frighten him. Before bed, he stood in the doorway of the pantry where the cedar trunk had rested. The trunk was gone. In its place sat boxes labeled with dates and places, ready to be delivered to an archive that anyone could visit. He touched the labels and thought of the moment his father had wept into the housekeeper's shoulder, the room holding the shape of a truth finally spoken aloud. He had not understood then how long the road would be. Now he knew. He closed the light, not upon a secret, but upon a beginning that would need to be chosen again each morning. And when he turned back down the hall, the house felt less like a fortress and more like a home with many doors.